All right, guys, so we are officially getting ready to jump into trig. Okay, now trig is all about finding the side lengths and angle measures of triangles, but we need to do a few things before we get into that. Okay, now one of these things we need to get into is identifying the parts of a right triangle. Okay, so we're going to look at this foldable here. It's just a little half sheet that we're going to stick into our interactive student notebook. And it just talks about the 3 different sides of a right triangle. Okay, so anytime we have a right triangle and we're using trig, we're going to go back to these 3 sides. And if you can't label and identify these 3 sides, then you will not be able to do trig. But the good thing is this is not difficult. You don't have to be a great math student to be able to identify the sides. All right, so let's first kind of talk about the vocab and label them. Okay, so the first one is the hypotenuse. Okay, now the hypotenuse, as you should know, is always the longest side of a right triangle. Okay, and we also know that it is always opposite of the right angle. Okay, so if I look at this diagram, here's the right angle. If I go opposite, this here would be my hypotenuse. Right? It's the longest side and it's across from the right angle. Okay, so the second side we're going to talk about is called the opposite side. Okay, now the opposite side on a triangle or on a right triangle when we do trig, we're going to have what we call a reference angle. And this here is going to be our reference angle. Okay, so sometimes we know the measure of this reference angle, sometimes we just have a marking, or sometimes it'll just say angle A or angle B or whatever. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but anyways, the opposite side, if this is a reference angle, is simply going to be opposite of that angle. Okay, so when I say opposite of this angle, that means I'm going through the triangle, and this would be the opposite. So I'm going to highlight opposite in green, and I'm going to highlight this side here in green as well. Okay, so there's 2 of the 3 sides. The last one is the adjacent side. Okay, now the adjacent side is next to the reference angle, but it is also not the hypotenuse. Okay, so if this is the reference angle here, this angle down below and this angle that's highlighted in yellow are both adjacent to this. However, this yellow one is the hypotenuse, which means that this one has to be the adjacent angle. Okay, so we're going to highlight that in blue and we're going to highlight adjacent in blue. All right, so let's do a few example problems, or a couple example problems. Okay, now if you're struggling, or even if you're not struggling, it's a good idea to always label them in this order: hypotenuse, then opposite, then adjacent. But first you have to identify your reference angle. So right here, angle C is our reference angle because we can see that little arc. Okay, so I'm going to do it in this order. The hypotenuse is always opposite of the right angle, so this is my hypotenuse. Okay, go ahead and I'm going to highlight it yellow. Okay, now I want opposite, and when I say opposite, I mean opposite of our reference angle. So I'm going to highlight that one purple. This is opposite. So side AB is opposite. Okay, and now the only one that's left over is our adjacent, so that's down here. And I'm going to go ahead and label this adjacent. Okay, now I want you to go ahead and do this triangle here on your right. Label each side. One of the sides is the hypotenuse, one is the opposite, and one is the adjacent. You can't have 2 hypotenuse, you can't have 2 opposite. You have to have one of each of those, and then we'll go over it. All right, so the first one I want to label is the hypotenuse, and I've already highlighted these. So opposite of the right angle is the hypotenuse. Okay, second one I want to label is the opposite. So my reference angle is angle B. Opposite is over here, side AC. And last but not least, my adjacent, that's just the third side that's left over. And we have labeled our first triangle.